Welcome to the wonderful world of wine, exploring all things wine with you. We are your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lenzi, and you can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. Hello and welcome to the wonderful world of wine. Every week, Mark and I investigate trending topics in the wine world and speak to interesting personalities from all over the wine industry. How are you today, Mark?
Everything's great, Kim.
Good.
Yourself?
I'm fine. Just love doing these podcasts with you and speaking to all these interesting people that we get the opportunity to. And today's special guest is Jim Spadaccini from Ideum. And oftentimes we'll speak to winemakers, wine writers. Today we have a little bit of something different. So welcome to the show, Jim.
I'm glad to be here.
So if you would be so kind as to let our listeners know a little bit about how you are doing what you're doing in the wine industry and the technology that you deal with.
Sure, Kim. I'd be happy to. Ideum is really we've been an exhibit design firm for 25 years. And during that time, we've done a few activations for different hospitality groups, and we've wound up doing a few interactive wine tastings. We do a lot of work with digital touch tables. And so as we've been doing this work, we have sort of developed this concept over time of building a digital tasting table that lets users go through and talk about or sort of explore what they're tasting and be able to share that and basically have a way digitally to enhance the wine tasting experience.
So, Jim, we're all about the gadgets on this show. We've done technology. I'm the gadget geek and technology. I come from a clinical engineering background. So when I saw your product, I said to Kim, this is something we have to let the listeners know that is out there. And I just have to ask, so the technology, I just want the listeners to kind of get a feel of what this is. When you're talking touchscreen, we're talking like a TV screen you can touch, and you built it into custom cabinetry, correct?
Correct. So for this particular product or initiative, it's probably a better way to describe it, we went back and designed a table explicitly for the tasting purpose. So the table has a 55-inch 4K screen. It's optically bonded to the touch sensor, which is essentially sort of a fancy way to say that this thing's been glued to the LCD. But that gives you a lot of strength, makes it impervious to spillage, which can happen in a wine tasting setting.
That was going to be one of my questions. To be like, oh my goodness, it's a touch screen and you're putting your glasses of wine on it.
Yeah, well, and then the other part about it that sort of makes it magic is based on another technology that we developed, almost 10 years ago, which is a technology called Tangible Engine. And that technology allows you to put coasters on the table that have basically touch patterns. They're capacitive touch patterns that are identified by the software. So what we can do is, if you're going to do a wine tasting, we can give you a specific coaster and it will tell you all about the wine you're drinking. So you just put that coaster on the table, it activates the table. But it's also in a wine tasting environment or a wine bar environment, it's also a bit of a gatekeeper. So you can't access the table unless you have the coaster. So that's actually come in on a few other projects that we've been involved in as a way to sort of control that public space. And most of the things that we've created over the years have been in that public space. So that's where we're really interested.
It sounds like something you would see at a museum, and especially those of our listeners who have little kids and, might go to children's museums and are familiar with all of these like touchscreen interactive kind of things. And I have never heard of one quite like this to use during a tasting. When I saw these articles about your product and I saw the pictures, and I think it's a little bit of a shame that we can't actually show a visual of what your tasting table looks like, because it really is so interesting and you can get so much detail in the information that you are presenting to the people who are participating in these wine tastings with this tasting table.
What I like about it is we've worked in visual and auditory and touch mediums for a long, long time in museums. We've sold hundreds of touch tables around the world to museums and others. But taste is like, it's a sense that we don't often get a chance to explore. It's such a great catalyst for conversation. And that's one of the things that we found with the touch table really early on, was that it, just like we all sit around a table and have a conversation, you can get around the touch table and have a conversation. So if you build something purpose built that allows you to do tastings and you're around that table and you're getting that feedback, a lot of good things can happen if you design it right. And we spent a lot of time doing a lot of prototyping and a lot of pop-up events and a lot of revisions to try to, make this experience, to try to add to the experience. I mean, I remember telling our team, like, hey, you've got 4 people around a table drinking wine. That's a great experience. But let's figure out how to make it better, because you could easily do the opposite, right? You could make it worse. Because everybody has a great time sitting around at any table drinking wine. Especially if it's good wine and good company, that's the experience. We were thinking, how do you elevate that experience further?
So, Jim, walk us through, I'm going to a restaurant or I'm going to a wine room. Your table is there. What is the actual process? I have to get the key to use. I mean, can the tables just be used as normal tables until someone interacts? So, like, what is the procedure?
Yeah, the experience is started through the coaster itself. So whoever would be running the wine bar or the tasting room would be the person who would give you the coaster. And each coaster is associated or can be associated with a wine. And usually the way we have it working right now in our sort of first installation in Albuquerque at the New Mexico Wine Association's tasting room is that you'd sign up for a tasting, you show up, and then they give you your first coaster. And your first coaster is the first wine that's going to be tasted. You place the coaster in a specified place on the table, and that essentially starts the experience. And then you're using touch to work your way through the rest of the experience.
So you're getting information about the wine, the winery, and then you can give feedback, right? You can give your tasting note type of thing with it.
Yeah, what's really cool is that it's the tasting part of the experience, which is really the core of the experience. We use a version of Ann Noble's aroma wheel, which has been open sourced and is out there. And there's hundreds of variations at this point. And we made our own variation. We actually made 2. We made one for still wines and one for sparkling. And essentially, you'll get your wine. There's a little bit of information about how to taste. You can skip that, but we also present it in a way where even newbies could glance at it and be able to tell what's going on. And then essentially, as you start to recognize different flavors or tastes, you would select those tastes on the wheel. Those flavors get recorded. We also have sweetness and acidity sliders that you can use. There's also one for effervescence on the sparkling one. And obviously the sparkling wheel has different qualities than the still wheel. But essentially you make the selection. So it's really about what you as the visitor taste. So it's less about going to a tasting room and having the wine owner or wine educator or sommelier say, oh, you should be tasting hints of this, or you should be recognizing this. It's really more about what you recognize. And what's cool about the program too is that once those flavors are recorded, then they get sent up to the cloud. So over time, the wineries or the wine bars, whoever the owner of the table is, they will get information about how people are tasting, what flavors they're recognizing in the wines that are included on the table.
You brought up an interesting point, which was that it's really consumer led. So the program itself isn't like leading the tasting. And that was actually going to be my next question, was how much of it is the technology of the table kind of leading people through the tasting. But you're saying that it's not, that it's completely the consumer is kind of taking their time and tasting the wines and then just putting in their own impressions. How have you found that works for brand new wine consumers who really kind of don't even know where to start?
Well, I think there's a couple ways to answer that. I think, first of all, if you're new to wine, what we've found, and we've done a half dozen pop-up events and we've been running tastings, gosh, weekly at the New Mexico Wine Association. What we've found is that a lot of people find the process much less intimidating
Mm.
than they would otherwise. I've had people say, wow, I've been to a couple tastings and this is the first one I've really felt comfortable at, which is really kind of interesting to me. And I think some of that is the sort of go at your own pace, non-judgmental. It's really about what you're tasting. With all that said, one of the most effective ways those tastings work is that a wine educator sets you up and then kind of checks in on the group
Uh-huh.
and fills in other questions they may have or provides more background. The tasting experience is very much automated, but there's a lot of opportunities to talk about other topics, to talk about winemaking process, to elaborate on what tastes people are experiencing. So we look at the program as a way not to automate or replace the wine educator or wine owner, although you could probably run more tastings than you would otherwise, right? It's really more of a way to flip the paradigm a little bit and to make it a little more interactive, a little more fun, and a lot less intimidating for new wine drinkers.
Jim, you mentioned sparkling wine. You have a new version. I saw a press release that you're now doing sparkling wine table technology. Is that something where you just adapted with the coaster, or did you have to develop new software in the table to support sparkling versus regular wine?
So we built a new software module. There were a couple things we recognized. Obviously, first off, we were going to use the wheel. The wheel would be vastly different, right? There's no brioche or yeast, as the flavor in still wine, but it's omnipresent in sparkling.
Don't we know it?
And there's a lot less flavors to select from because basically sparkling's a lot less complex. It just is. It has its own complexity, effervescence and all of that.
Ooh,
But
we could
it's
get
not.
into a fight about this. Ooh.
Yeah, yeah. But we're also not doing like our current wheel does, you can taste white, rosé, orange wine, red wine. It's a robust wheel. On the still wheel, I think there's 60 flavors. On the sparkling wheel, I think there's 30.
I'm kidding. I'm a champagne specialist, so it's like near and dear to my heart.
Well, the other thing that's sort of funny though about it is that when we got into the sparkling, what we realized was when it comes to tasting still wines, we kind of have it like, yeah, you could go through this if you're new or you can skip. And we realized you can't do that.
Yeah.
How you taste it is as important as what you taste. There's no swirling. There's no, it's like it's a different thing. So we wanted to be true to that. And so that's why we went and made those adjustments in the module. We also had the advantage that in New Mexico, sparkling is a big part of what the state of New Mexico does. I mean, Gruet was here. One of our advisors was Laurent Gruet, who's working with Vara in New Mexico. So we also had a lot of local expertise that we could draw on that wound up being really important to creating a module that made sense. And that was actually one thing that was very cheering for me when we debuted this at the Unified Conference in Sacramento was that I didn't get anybody who said, why is that on the wheel? Or why did you structure this way? Or everybody seemed to kind of agree that this was a good way to do it. Now, they might not have, mentioned it all the way through. I was a little worried just because the wine world is so big and unwieldy that and maybe we just haven't run into them yet, but that you'd have somebody who comes in critically about, oh, I wouldn't taste like that, or why is that on the wheel, or why isn't this on the wheel, that kind of thing. So
I'm sure you'll hear from them eventually.
yes, yeah, yeah,
You know,
it's right.
full of opinions, this industry.
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, and that's actually part of why having a table is not a bad, I feel like it's the old, and this is like a overly used metaphor in the education world, but it's like often it's the sage on the stage talking about wine rather than the guide on the side, and doesn't help new people get interested in wine. It can be intimidating when people approach wine designed that way. And part of that is just inherent in the complexity, the long history, and the fact that you've got some people that are absolute super tasters. I mean, I've worked with a few sommeliers that have just blown my mind, just how much knowledge they have and how they can keep track of it all.
I
So
actually got
Jim,
that question yesterday from someone. They're like, "How do you remember all of this?" I'm like, "I don't know. How does a doctor remember how to do, a particular, I don't know, procedure?" It's like, well,
right, but I
it's
do
what we
think
do. So,
yeah, there is something unique though, because I think it's like part of it is being a super taster and being Mr. or Mrs. Memory, right?
mm,
Like it's like when I worked with this one sommelier in Europe on a project we did, he would taste something and he would say, "Oh, that's from this region. Oh, that's this winery. Oh, that's this vintage."
hmm
Like, how in the world? Like, it just seemed so alien to me. Somebody could be that good at that, you know?
yeah,
So
those
They
it,
people are
taste,
out there.
taste,
yeah.
taste, taste. That's how they do it. They
Right.
taste
Well,
everything.
but I think part of it is like the bigger question for the industry is how do you get people started to
Yeah.
taste, right? Because you have this drop off. You have kind of an aging wine drinking population, and you've got a lot of competition from craft beer and things like that for younger people. How do you turn those folks into wine drinkers?
It's technology like yours that draws them in to explore it. So that's a good thing.
I think it's the technology in part, but I think the other part is giving people agency. I mean, we see that in the museum world all the time. The most successful exhibits are when you ask the visitor to do something, to make something, to create something, to share something. And I think that's the kind of principles that we were bringing into this process.
And I think that comes back to the conversation about how do you remember? How does one who works in wine day in and day out remember these things? And I think that what you said is exactly on point, is that it's experiential. And when you're doing it and you're experiencing it through your senses, there's something about that that sticks in your memory. And I think that's why I can remember a lot of the things that I've tasted and remember either, what I had this wine in a particular situation or with a particular person or with food or where were we. I think because you're involving so many of your other senses there too, that your memory interacts with the information in a different way. And I love this tie-in between wine tasting, wine experience, and the museum experience, because that does seem to be when you involve all of your senses and you're doing an activity like this, and like you said, there's agency for the person who's doing it, then you create so much more of a memory and just a learning experience for people.
Right. And I think that's exactly right, Kim. In the museum world, when you first start getting involved, you hear very early on, visitor centric or visitor focused. And it's really about the visitor. And the museums that cater to the visitor, that are more outward looking to their visitors in the community rather than inward looking at their own collections, their own curators, those are the museums that are successful. And I think you could probably take that into the world of hospitality, into the world of wine, where those who are successful really focus on the people who are drinking the wine, not necessarily on themselves. Although I could see why you could. I mean, some of these wineries create such fantastic wine. It's like creating works of art, but that's what museums have too, right?
You're listening to The Wonderful World of Wine, and we are your hosts, Mark Lenzi and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. Today, our special guest is Jim Spadaccini, and he is with Ideum. You can find him at ideum.com. And if you want more information about Kim and I, you can go to our website. It's www.wine. Our program is supported by Franklin Public Radio. We're here with Jim Spadaccini. So we're talking about the tasting table, this new technology that can explore wine with. And I just want to kind of clarify in my head here, Jim, if the table seats 4 people, correct? Four
Correct.
people at one. Okay. So if, say, I go to the winery and I pick up the coaster and I want to do a still wine, and Kim comes in and she picks up one for a sparkling wine, and then someone else comes in and picks up something for, say, a beer or a spirit, can each individual person sitting at their table screen do their own module?
No, it's not designed that way.
Okay, so
It's
everybody's got the same module at the same
Well,
time?
yeah, part of it is that right now there's two modules. There's one for still wines and one for sparkling. So you can't do mixed tastings with still and sparkling because they're basically two different pieces of software.
But
What
everybody has their own individual section of the table in front of them?
Correct.
Okay.
But the way to think about it is that's one program, right?
Okay.
With all that said, we support up to 8 different wines per tasting, which is sort of overkill. I mean, I can't imagine doing more than 4 or 5. Your palate would be kind of shot, but some people do.
We do 6 in classes, so
You
yeah,
do?
anywhere between like 4 and 8 does seem like a lot. That
It
you you,
does. It
you get a
does.
lot of wine too.
Right. So you could do mixed tastings for still wine and mixed tastings for sparkling with up to 8 different wines. But we don't really encourage that either. I think what we like about the table and what we found from doing a lot of tastings is that folks really enjoy being on the same page and talking about what they're tasting. And that winds up being a big part of the activity. And this is really built as a social experience. So what it does is you all have a shared surface that you all work on. So you're not on your own individual computer or your own individual phone. And we want to encourage people to have those conversations because one of the things we've learned in the museum world is that's kind of where the magic happens. And there's a thing that I always say, which is like only museum professionals go to museums alone. I think that's probably true for wine tastings. Maybe only wine professionals would go to a wine tasting alone.
Yeah.
I've done that actually on a couple of occasions, but that's because I'm weird that way.
I mean, we
Most
often do tell people that the best way to learn not only about wine, but also about like honing your palate is doing it with other people. And it's not the same, even if you have like a tasting note in front of you that's describing like what the wine is all about. It's so much more valuable when you can exchange ideas with other people. This is making me think back to like during COVID when we all were just playing board games all the time. This is like the ultimate wine tasting board game. It's like you're doing it all together.
Right. Well,
It's a really cool concept.
and that's the hope is that the technology isn't like, oh, I'm going to withdraw into my technology like you do on a lot of personal technology. It's more like I'm going to be in this social experience
Hmm.
and we're all going to talk about things. And sometimes it isn't necessarily about what you're tasting. That's okay too. But I think the idea is that we want that tasting, that social situation to be that catalyst. One other thing that's interesting is that when we've done these tastings, the phones don't come out.
Yeah.
In
Cool.
fact, they only come out when we get toward the end because you can get a QR code to either join the wine club or buy the bottle. We decided to keep that on people's personal hardware and not create our table into a point of sale.
Hmm.
That the table is really about tasting. That's what it is. That's what it does. And then everything else can be kind of built around that.
So there's no need to put ads or anything on it because they're in that winery and they know they can buy. So there's no like ad sharing or things like that that come up on the screen to distract them from the tasting.
No, and in fact, we have it so the software can be branded to be about the winery or about the wine bar or about the wine association or the distributor or whoever winds up being the owner of the table. So that's part of what we've built in is this way so that it feels like it's very much about the winery itself. And if you were looking at it with a different hat on instead of the sort of education or museum experience or, wine educator, you could look at this from a marketing or brand standpoint. And it's something that deepens people's appreciation and understanding of what you produce and what your brand produces in a very meaningful way. To me, there's a lot of power there. But again, that power is derived from the experience and it's derived from people taking something out of it themselves, which is either they're learning something new about wine or the winery, they're learning something new about winemaking or taste, or they're broadening their own horizons, learning how to taste wine more effectively and getting a greater appreciation for wine.
I'm just appreciating all of this kind of new way of looking at wine education. This is a real new one. I'm totally fascinated by this.
So Jim, who approaches you more interested in the technology? Is it wineries? Is it restaurants? And do they rent these or do they buy? What's the process of them getting them?
Sure. Well, we're kind of just getting started. So, in fact, we just announced that the product was for sale at Unified. We are talking to a couple wineries in California. We have heard from folks from everything from academia to wine bars to people who put on events. We're also talking to a major brewery in Europe about building a beer experience.
Hmm.
Which is for us has been a little bit of a shift. We investigated beer many years ago, haven't looked at it so much recently or just starting to. I think some of it is to kind of go where the interest is, but the interest has been pretty broad. And in fact, we wound up hearing from a couple different museums, one in California, and we have one in New Mexico that's going to rent our table for an event that they have called the Science of Wine. And that's a fundraising event that they do. And they're looking at the table as a way to make it more participatory and more special. At some point, we'll probably wind up renting these nationwide. But for the meantime, we're not focused on that just because there's a lot of logistics work that goes with that for each event. We do it with our standard touch tables, mostly for trade shows. But I imagine we'll have rentals later this year. And I imagine we'll be talking about our first installations in the next few weeks.
And recently I saw you won Digital Signage Award in Las Vegas for the restaurant category. I think they called it the Dizzy Award. And I was wondering if you could tell us about that.
Sure. So we've gone to this conference a couple of times. It's an industry conference all about digital signage, as one would expect with the name. And they have a variety of different categories. And we won an award from them, boy, in an experimental category several years ago. We put in our award for restaurants and we were up against, I don't know, the holographic Bon Jovi. And I was like, you guys, we're going to lose to a holographic Bon Jovi.
It's still Bon Jovi. It's still Bon
Yeah,
Jovi.
yeah. But like we thought, oh, well, we're not going to win because this is this big proto box, and it's $1 million startup and big restaurant and all that. And we were surprised because we wound up winning with essentially at that point what had been, I think we had just completed our first installation. We were very much the new kids on the block with this application and managed to win, and so that was very exciting and very gratifying and gotten a really great response. And I think for us, it's a question now of getting the word out and getting a few of those early adopters and really getting this going.
I love the kiosk idea, the digital signage. I'm all about being in retail, working with these digital signage companies to put things all over the store. Is there anything you see down the road where it's some sort of retail version as far as an interactive kiosk or interactive shelf talkers? Is there anything of that, or is the focus just tasting tables right now?
I think the focus for us is on the tasting table. I've been thinking a lot about tasting as the core of the experience, but that you could create or expand that experience beyond that. People talk about sensory dining, and you've probably seen that where it's like projection and there's some kind of story associated with it, and you eat your meal and it's sort of like being in projection environment, like being in the movie or whatever, but it's not terribly participatory most of the instances, and it's somewhat low fidelity. But it's curious to me or interesting to me because it does set mood and it creates a setting and it can broadly tell a story. What I think would be interesting is you could have tasting tables and then activate a larger space, even based on what people taste. So you could change the environment as people go through the application in some way and make the whole environment more interesting, more exciting, maybe a little more immersive. And that's what a lot of sensory dining is, very immersive, but this is not necessarily an immersive experience. It's much more of a social experience. So I think you could bring in other elements that you'd find in other aspects of sensory dining. You could make a tasting room much more interesting, right?
The technology is just amazing. I thought I saw something where, and maybe this is the normal touch screen technology, but I saw you can have 80 touch points on the screen.
Yep.
Is that like the normal, or is that something that you guys have a patent on or something?
That's sort of the best of class, if you will, in terms of touch sensors. And that's what we use. That's what we we integrate. That technology was originally developed by 3M. And the reason 80 touch points is important is that each coaster consumes 3 to 4 touch points. So if you have 4 coasters with 4 touch points down, you've got 16 touch points used, right? So you need to have enough touch points remaining that people can touch the table. The other thing, though, that I think it says about that technology is that, hey, this technology is really responsive, because often what the manufacturers will do is they'll cap the touch points at 20. 20 wouldn't be enough for a touch table where you have coasters. It just wouldn't work. So it's also a question of the responsiveness and quality of the touch system. And these are systems that, gosh, we've been building now for 15 years. We've been deeply interested in this technology, and we've learned a ton about it over the years, and have really kind of got to the point where we selected what we think is the best components, and then we build them into very hardened touch tables, and the tasting table is a good example of that as well.
I saw you make beautiful custom work. The museum items you put in and the marble tables, your shop there does beautiful custom work.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, a lot of that custom work. So we did an installation for MSC Cruise Lines, and we did custom tables, and we have a wine app there that lets you explore 97 different wines. The tasting component is different. It's like a group-led, sommelier-led interaction. But just learning about the wines works kind of the same way, except that there's one coaster, and then you have to go kind of find your wine, if you will. But those kind of projects, I think we learn a lot in those kind of projects. And I also think that's also something else that we can add. So if people are looking for, if you have an architect that's working on your tasting room and there's a specific look for it, then that's something where we can customize the table or create new tables that would fit in with the decor or with the look of the space.
You mentioned the wine room can get the data of what the user said about their wine. Is that a separate component built within the table to allow you to get that data reports out and everything to them, or is it just all one?
Yeah,
system?
that's in the content management system. So each table that's sold, you get basically a login to the cloud where you can add the content. So you can add the wine. You can also hire us to do it, but you can add the wine, you can add information about your winery, etc. In that same CMS, it's going to log all the sessions that happen on that table and tell you what people are tasting. And I think in some ways, that's sort of the hidden superpower, if you will, of the table, because I think a lot of wineries would be very curious to think about what 100 or 500 people going through their tasting room think about their wine and see whether it matches their own tasting notes. I'd be very curious about that. So I think that's an interesting aspect to this. The other thing that we've been thinking about, and we haven't implemented it yet because it's sort of a chicken and the egg problem, is that we should be able to build a module that presents that information back to the user. So it might be that, hey, I'm tasting blackberries and oak in this wine, and hey, 44% of the people who've tasted it tasted blackberries, and 33% tasted oak, or whatever that might be. So I think in some ways too, it could also be used as a way for people to learn a little bit more about tasting and be able to even compare what they're tasting with others who've been in the space, not just with the winery's tasting notes themselves.
Do they rate it at all, or give it a thumbs up or thumbs down, an overall opinion at the end, or?
So we decided against that, although I've been having second thoughts about that. I've seen some very benign ways that people say, great, good, not quite.
Smiley, smiley
something
emojis.
like that. We tried to leave out a lot of the negative things in the application. And I know that almost sounds like cheating, but it isn't. Like, we decided vinegar wasn't going to be on the wheel. Tar wasn't going to be on the wheel. If the wine tastes like vinegar or tar, then you've got bigger problems.
I get tar all the time. Vinegar, tar.
I don't know. We felt
Chilean Cabernet.
so that might be the kind of thing where we'd have to have a conversation about it.
Yeah, I think we should chat.
Yeah. You know what's interesting though? One of the things about the wheel that we talked about was, and I don't know whether this would be possible or not, but I mean, I know it would be possible. I don't know whether it would make sense to do it, was to have a way where people could customize the wheel. But there are some operational issues, like we have to assign code to pick out those particular flavors or aromas. Well, I think what might happen down the road is certainly we haven't gotten a lot of complaints yet, but Kim, I'll note your tar complaint. And I think what could happen is we'll modify the wheel, or we may have different versions of the wheel that different people could load into their application down the road. So, for example, like if you're just tasting white, 3/4 of that wheel is sort of irrelevant, you know? And we know that. Whether it makes sense to make a red and a white, and then you probably have to do something for rosé and orange wines, or maybe you group them with the white.
Gets kind of complicated, doesn't it?
It does. And we really wanted to keep this simple and focused on the experience itself, and knowing that we wouldn't get absolutely everything right. That's why we did so much more prototyping with this than we do on most of our exhibits. And we do a lot of prototyping on it. Like we bring everybody through in the office. You didn't work on that project? Great. You can test it for
Test case.
Yep. And, you know, not everybody at the office drinks. A lot of the folks are young. So it's a little harder for us to do the wine tastings. So we needed local partners.
I think it would be a great tool for wine rooms, for wine education people, anybody who's doing wine education. I think it'd be a great tool. They can set up all different modules to get people up to speed. I think it's really interesting product. So I appreciate you telling our listeners about it today, Jim.
Oh, no, I'm happy to have the opportunity to. And I should mention one other thing. The last place I worked before I started the company was the Exploratorium in San Francisco, which is a hands-on science museum. And I produced the last event that I worked on there was the Science of Wine, and Ann Noble showed up with the wheel.
Wow.
So people say,
cool.
like, when people ask me like, oh, how long have you been working on this? I have two answers. One is about a year. The other one is 25 years, you know?
Yeah.
So in some ways, this has been a real passion project. So I really appreciate the opportunity to tell your listeners about it.
Well, we love all the creative ways that people can be involved in wine. It doesn't just have to be being a wine writer or being somebody who sells wine or produces wine, but there's folks like you out there that has a passion for it and brings their creativity and a new way of looking at wine to all of us. And as educators, we really appreciate that there are people like you out there.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you for listening to us today on The Wonderful World of Wine. We have been your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lenzi. You can find more information about us and our past episodes of the show at thewww.wine. Also, our Facebook page, The Wonderful World of Wine. Our special guest today was Jim Spadaccini. You can find Jim on his website, ideum.com. That's ideum.com. Cheers.
Cheers.